It's the 25th of January 2026, a cold Sunday's night, the eve of the biggest Formula One regulation reset in over a decade, and across the paddock, everything is quiet. The garages are closed, the tools have been packed away, and mechanics are grabbing whatever sleep they can before months of chaos begin. It's the calm before the storm, but somewhere in the distance, you start to hear something. You stop for a second. Wait, I thought I was in Barcelona. Last time I checked, this was in England. And you'd be right, because you see, those chants aren't coming from football fans. They're coming from the thousands of Fernando Alonso supporters who truly believe that 2026 was finally going to be their year. And after years of false dawns, after Ferrari heartbreak, the McLaren GP2 engine, and even El Plan, after what feels like every questionable career move ever imaginable, Fernando Alonso had finally been handed what many believed was his greatest opportunity. Adrian Newey, a brand new Works Honda partnership, a state-of-the-art facilities, and limited ambition, and a clean sheet of regulations. On paper, it had everything needed to build a championship-winning Formula One car. There was just one slight problem. Whenever fans start chanting, "It's coming home," it usually never ends well. Just ask England or France, and unfortunately for Aston Martin, history looks set to have repeated itself once again. Because instead of producing the rocket ship that everyone expected, Adrian Newey appeared to have designed a tractor. Yeah, now that's left Aston Martin with two choices. Option one, throw small upgrades at the problem every weekend and chase tiny gains and hope they slowly crawl back towards the midfield. Or accept the painful start to the season, take the criticism, become the punchline of the joke of Formula One, and gamble everything on one huge turnaround later in the year. And if you know Adrian Newey, you probably know which option he chose. Because turns out, the greatest designer of Formula One history isn't just an engineer, he's a gambler. So, did Aston Martin's biggest gamble actually pay off? This is hard rubber. Take off those softs, put on them hards, and with that, let's talk about it. It's the 26th of January 2026, Circuit de Barcelona, Catalunya. The first official shakedown of Formula One's new era after months of speculation. Today was finally supposed to be the day. The day that Adrian Newey unveiled his very first Aston Martin, his first clean sheet design under the new regulations, and Aston Martin's first car powered by their brand new Works Honda engine. The hypes around this project had become enormous. Not just from Aston Martin fans or Fernando Alonso faithful, but also from rival teams too, because whenever Adrian Newey builds a completely new Formula One car, people tend to pay attention. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. What has the master of aerodynamics cooked up this time? For Alonso fans, this wasn't just another season. This was supposed to be the redemption. Years of pain, years of memes, and years of next year. Finally, it was genuine belief that Fernando Alonso might finally actually have another championship fight in him. So what exactly happened? Well, nothing. Literally. Because Aston Martin didn't even have a car ready.
What?
Yeah, great start. Instead of rolling into the paddock with Formula One's next masterpiece, Aston Martin arrived carrying little more than dreams, Lawrence Stroll's wallet, and what is effectively an IOU, because the AMR 26 simply wasn't finished. While every other team spent the opening days collecting precious mileage, Aston Martin watched from the sidelines. One day passed, then another. The team wouldn't actually appear until day 4 of the 5-day shakedown. I mean, at least we knew that the Honda engine made some noise and that the car would probably be green, right? Well, sort of. Still, the wait was almost over because finally, on the penultimate day, Lawrence Stroll climbed aboard the AMR 26 and strolled to the paddock to complete its first laps. Months of anticipation had led to this moment. Adrian Newey's masterpiece, the Honda Power, the British racing green, Fernando Alonso's supposed championship contender, the Mercedes conquering, the aggressive, the title-winning, airflow-bending Honda VTEC Newey Masterclass. No, it stopped after 4 laps. Nice. Well, just winter testing, right? Now, to be fair, cars breaking down during winter testing isn't exactly something unusual. New regulations, brand new engines, fresh chassis, everyone expects a few headaches. But Aston Martin's problems weren't just teething issues, they were symptoms of something much bigger. You see, Adrian Newey later explained that development of the AMR 26 had actually started unusually late, because the team deliberately waited for the completion of Aston Martin's brand new wind tunnel before beginning serious work on the 2026 project. This meant that Newey arrived with almost a blank canvas, and it wasn't just refining the previous Aston Martin, he was rebuilding the philosophy from scratch. Then come the challenge of putting everything together: a completely new power unit, a brand new rear suspension, an in-house gearbox and transmission program that Aston Martin hadn't attempted since their Force India days. And according to team ambassador Pedro de la Rosa, it all came together far later than planned. Suddenly, missing the opening days of testing started making a lot more sense. Sure, it wasn't ideal, but many believed that by the time the Australian Grand Prix came around, it would be a completely different story. Finish testing, iron out the gremlins, and unlock the performance. Job done. Except that's not what happened. Because once the racing actually started, it quickly became obvious that Aston Martin hadn't just arrived late. They'd arrived with one of the most fundamentally flawed cars on the grid. And that's where the story really begins. So, what was actually wrong with the AMR 26? Well, where do I even begin to start? Because calling the AMR 26 slow would actually be doing it a favor. You see, the thing wasn't just off the pace, it was actively trying to assassinate its own drivers. No, seriously, the biggest issue wasn't even the lap time, it was the violent vibrations ripping through the entire car. And these weren't the kind of vibrations that make your vision go a little blurry. These were severe enough that Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll struggled to complete even a race distance during the early opening rounds of the season. Imagine spending hundreds of millions building a Formula 1 car only for it to double as a full body massage chair. Oh, Adrian. I think you misunderstood what people meant when they said they wanted more driver feedback. But the vibrations were only the beginning, because the AMR 26 was also overweight, it lacked downforce, the balance was inconsistent, and the handling was unpredictable at the best of times. Components kept falling off, mirrors flew off, and tail lights detached, and batteries suffered repeated damage due to the vibrations. And to top it all off, the seating position left both drivers looking like they'd been folded into a car built by IKEA. Thanks to Newey's incredible aggressive packaging designed to optimize the center of gravity and reduce helmet weight disturbance, comfort had clearly taken a backseat, which wouldn't be unusual in Adrian Newey built cars. Now, Fernando Alonso has driven some absolute horrors over the years. I mean, the McLaren Honda, Ferrari F14T, and the Renault R28. He's seen some things, but even by Alonso standards, this thing looked miserable. At this point, the only team Aston Martin consistently had covered was Cadillac. And that's saying something, because Cadillac spent half of the season treating brake fires like they were part of the race weekend schedule. Yet somehow they still look faster than Aston Martin. So clearly being a little bit behind in development wasn't the real problem. Something much bigger was going on, and naturally, it didn't take long before the finger pointing began. Cause you see, whenever a Formula 1 project goes wrong, there's one guarantee. Nobody wants to be the one holding the grenade when it explodes, and so Aston Martin did the logical thing and blamed Honda. Everyone else grabbed the popcorn, and from Aston Martin's perspective, the culprit was obvious, because according to Adrian Newey, the chassis itself had genuine potential. The problem was that the Honda power unit was producing severe vibrations that the stiff carbon fiber monocoque simply couldn't absorb. Instead, these vibrations traveled through the chassis and damaged the batteries, broke components, and limited the mileage Aston Martin desperately needed to understand the rest of the package. Newey didn't exactly dance around the issue either. He publicly stated that Honda needed to solve the vibration problems before Aston Martin could even properly develop the car. And there were even some reports from within the paddock by journalists that Honda's first engine installed hadn't even fitted the chassis as intended. That forced Aston Martin into a frantic redesign of the rear and just try to make everything work before testing. So, case closed, right? Honda messed up, Newey was innocent, and roll the credits. Well, not quite, because you see, Honda had a very different version of events. You see, Honda admitted they hadn't achieved every performance target they had originally set for 2026, But they did reject the idea that the power unit alone was responsible, because according to Honda, the engine behaved perfectly normal on their dynos back in Sakura, and that the excessive vibrations only appeared once the engine was installed into the Aston Martin chassis. So what was their argument, you might ask? Well, the AMR26's extremely stiff design, combined with the incredible tight packaging, was amplifying the vibrations instead of dampening them. In other words, Honda believed that Aston Martin had built a chassis that made an acceptable problem become an unacceptable one. To Honda, it wasn't just an engine issue, it was an integration issue. And to be fair, Honda did have one very reasonable excuse, because after officially stepping away from Formula 1 back in 2021, they effectively dismantled much of their works operation. Many experienced engineers had moved elsewhere, some of which to Red Bull powertrains, while others were assigned to different Honda projects. So when Honda committed to returning in 2023, they weren't simply improving on an existing program, they were rebuilding one almost from scratch. Now that does take time, and under completely new engine regulations, time was the one thing they didn't have. The problem explains why they started the season slightly behind schedule. The problem is just Formula 1 doesn't hand out sympathy points, especially when another manufacturer had almost faced the exact same situation. Red Bull powertrains also started from scratch, yet by the opening races of 2026, they had already apparently produced one of the strongest power units on the grid, which makes Honda's defense a little harder to sell. So who was actually right? Well, as the championship moved from circuit to circuit, the answer simply became obvious. Neither side was telling the whole story, but neither side was lying either. Take Monaco, for example, one of the least power sensitive tracks on the calendar. If Honda's engine was solely to blame, this should have been Aston Martin's chance to shine, but instead, they qualified P21 and 22. That's dead last. Again. Ironically though, they somehow escaped Monaco with a single championship point, not because the car suddenly became competitive though, but because 7 cars retired and the stewards started handing out penalties like Oprah giving away cars. You get a penalty, you get a penalty, everybody gets a penalty. Lucky, absolutely convincing, not even slightly. Monaco exposed exactly what Aston Martin didn't want to admit. The chassis itself lacked slow speed grip, it lacked balance, it lacked confidence through the corners, and even with the engine performance playing a much smaller role, the AMR26 was still not competitive. But don't worry, then came around Spa, a circuit where horsepower actually matters, and this time Honda got his turn in the spotlight. Alonso and Stroll qualified P21 and 22. Again, tough times never lost, right? At this point, they may as well had personalized parking bays at the back of the grid, because they were getting quite used to it at this point. Alonso finished qualifying over 5.5 seconds behind the pole sitter Kimi Antonelli, and during the race, things somehow became even worse. Stroll retired, again, nothing new there, and Alonso crossed the finish line. But 2 laps behind the winner. 2 entire laps. Wherever it was Monaco exposing the chassis or Spa exposing the engine, the results never really changed, because you see the AMR26 was slow everywhere. Which leads us to the uncomfortable conclusion that Honda was right, but Aston Martin was right too, because both of them were also completely wrong. Because this wasn't an engine issue and it wasn't a chassis problem either, it was both. The power unit wasn't good enough and the chassis wasn't good enough either, and the integration wasn't good enough, and altogether, they accidentally created one of the least competitive Formula 1 cars in the modern era. The dream project that was supposed to bring Fernando Alonso back to the front had become one of Formula 1's biggest appointments. But despite all that, there was one thing Aston Martin still had: hope. Because instead of trying to fix everything with tiny upgrades every other weekend, Adrian Newey had quietly been working on something much bigger. A gamble that would define Aston Martin's entire season. And after months of suffering, the gamble was finally almost ready. Now, they say that history has a funny way of repeating itself. The more this whole blame game gets dragged on, the more and more it starts to feel eerily familiar, nearly like we've seen this movie before. Now, cast your back all the way to 2015, McLaren, Honda, Fernando Alonso, a brand new works partnership engine, huge expectations, an ambitious chassis, and of course an underprepared Honda engine. And, well, eventually Now fast forward to 2026 and it starts to look very similar. Aston Martin, Honda, Fernando Alonso, a brand new works engine partnership, a revolutionary set of regulations, and once again a team with championship ambitions had found themselves pointing fingers at Honda before the season had barely got going. Sound familiar? Well, the similarities don't stop there because just like McLaren back then, Aston Martin were also Honda's only customer, which meant that there would be less mileage, less data, less comparison, and every problem had to be solved almost entirely on their own. But unlike 2015, something did seem to change. Because eventually, both Aston Martin and Honda realized something, that they could keep arguing over whose fault it was, or they could actually try and fix it. And thankfully, for once, it seems common sense won, because as the season progressed, the blame game slowly disappeared, and behind doors, both parties just accepted joint responsibility for their failures. Communication improved, and therefore the relationship improved as well. And instead of chasing headlines, they quietly locked in and started chasing solutions. But of course, there was one final decision to make, and that was, do they continue bringing tiny upgrades every race, hoping to claw back a 10th here and another 10th there, while never truly understanding the car? Or do you accept that 2026 is going to be a bit of a stinker and that you're probably going to become the butt of the joke, and instead put absolutely everything into one massive upgrade package that could change it all? And one thing's clear, it seems that Adrian Newey had made his choice months prior. He was going all in. It's the 24th of July 2026 and the Hungarian Grand Prix weekend has arrived. After months of waiting, the AMR 26 B-spec had finally arrived. Now, Aston Martin were very careful with this wording, at least according to Adrian Newey. This wasn't a B-spec car, it was simply an evolution. Yeah, and 6'7". Because when your car needs another FIA crash test, features 16 separate upgrades, loses a significant amount of weight, and almost every aerodynamic surface of the car changes, that's a little bit more than an evolution, Adrian. It's basically a new car wearing the old one's passports, and the paddock knew it, the media knew it, and the fans definitely knew it. The only question left was, would it be enough to help give Aston Martin the jump they needed? Friday.
It's Friday then! Saturday, Sunday, what? Yeah, it's okay.
The first practice had finally arrived, and it was time to see the AMR 26B finally stroll onto the circuit, with everyone eager to see what Adrian Newey had cooked up this time. The cars got out, they did a few laps, and oh look, Lance Stroll's car has stopped. Well, isn't that new? Yeah, well, before Lance Stroll's rear suspension decided it had seen enough of Hungary, the early signs were at least pretty encouraging. Fernando Alonso finished the session in P13, and although that's nothing headline worthy, it at least looked competitive. And for Aston Martin, competitive was already a massive improvement over where they had started the year. FP2 came, and well, yeah, not much to say here either. Alonso finished P19 and Stroll didn't even manage to set a representative lap after the earlier reliability issues, so yeah, not ideal, but Friday practice exists for exactly that reason. Break things today, so hopefully they don't break tomorrow when it counts. At least that was the plan. Then came Saturday and the final practice session of the weekend, and it went without too much drama. I mean, Alonso finished P17 and Lance P18. On paper, it didn't look like anything particularly exciting, but I think once the telemetry data started circulating, the picture became a lot more interesting, because for the first time all season, the Aston Martin's chassis actually looked respectable.
What?
Corner speeds were significantly improved and the balance looked a lot healthier. It's like the aerodynamic platform was finally behaving as intended. In fact, around the Hungaroring, they looked remarkably close to the Racing Bulls through many of the corners. The biggest weakness now being, you guessed it, the Honda engine. Which, strangely enough, was actually pretty good news, because aerodynamic performance is something Aston Martin can continue to improve. And with Honda already having a power unit upgrade plan for Zandvoort after the summer break, suddenly there was a genuine development path. And then qualifying. The moment Aston Martin had finally been waiting for all season. Could they finally escape Q1? Well, cue the dramatic music because... well, Q2! For the first time in 2026, Aston Martin actually made it out the first qualifying session. Now, Alonso did squeeze into Q2 by finishing P16. It wasn't exactly front row territory, but after what they'd been through, it genuinely felt like a victory. Unfortunately for Lance, it was a session that unraveled before he could really complete his next runs, leaving him down in P20. Still, the trend was obvious. The car had taken a step forward. Was it still nearly 2 seconds off Lando Norris? Yes, but Formula 1 isn't about finding 2 seconds overnight. It's about proving at least you're going in the right direction. And at least for now, it finally feels like Aston Martin are. Then Sunday came around. Race day, yes. This was the real test because yes, 1 lap pace is a nice surprise. Race pace is what actually wins you championships. Or at the very least, it wins the midfield battle. Lights out and away we go, and for the first time all season, Aston Martin actually looked normal. No embarrassing pace deficit, no falling backwards immediately, no spin in the afternoon as Cadillac's emotional support. Instead, they raced. Actually raced. They battled Alpine, they fought in the midfield, and they left Williams, Haas, and Cadillac behind. And perhaps the most surprising part of all, Fernando Alonso was overtaking people on track in 2026. I honestly wasn't even convinced this was physically possible after the opening races. Sure, Aston Martin still managed to outsmart themselves strategically because apparently old habits die hard. But despite that, Alonso genuinely looked capable of fighting for the points on merit. Think about that. A few months earlier, they couldn't even complete a race distance, and now they were disappointed not to score points. That alone tells you how much it changed. By the checkered flag, Stroll crossed the line in P13 and Alonso finished P14. No points, but perhaps something even more valuable. Proof that the package worked. Proof that the wind tunnel's correlation was finally there. Proof that Adrian Newey's direction actually made sense. And perhaps most importantly, proof that Aston Martin were no longer rooted to the back of the field. Post-race, the mood inside the Aston Martin camp couldn't have been more different. Alonso couldn't hide his excitement, Stroll praised the improvements, and Pedro de la Rosa described the race pace as even more encouraging than the qualifying. For the first time all year, there was genuine optimism inside the team, and the numbers backed it up. Compared to Racing Bulls, arguably the benchmark of the midfield teams throughout the opening half of the season, Aston Martin were now only around half a second slower per lap on average in Hungary. That's a huge jump, especially considering where they started, with even more aerodynamic upgrades still to come, and more weight set to be coming off the car, and even a revised gearbox on the way, and above all, the Honda engine upgrade that is still waiting for Zandvoort. If that delivers the extra power that Aston Martin are looking for, then suddenly the second half of the season starts looking very different. So did the gamble pay off? Well, honestly, I think it's hard to argue that it didn't. Because it was never about Hungary alone, it was about proving the concept. Proving that Adrian Newey hadn't lost his magic, and proving that Aston Martin's incredible investment wasn't for nothing. And of course, proving to Fernando Alonso that this project was finally moving in the right direction. I mean, just think about what this team has assembled for a second. One of the Formula One's greatest designers, one of the greatest drivers of the modern era, a state-of-the-art facility, a works Honda partnership that had previously just powered Max Verstappen to nearly 5 championship titles in a row. Billions invested. Realistically, how long could all these ingredients stay uncompetitive? Eventually, something had to click, and judging by Hungary, maybe, just maybe, it finally has. Now, is this enough to convince Fernando Alonso that another world championship is genuinely possible? Probably not. At least, not yet. One race doesn't erase 6 months of frustration, but it does restore belief, because for the first time this season, Fernando Alonso looked like he genuinely believed again. And if there's one driver you don't want to give hope to, That's Fernando Alonso. Maybe Aston Martin's gamble really has paid off, or maybe this is simply another false dawn. Only time will tell. The only question is, will you be joining Aston Martin on the hype train? But let me know in the comments down below. If you guys enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit notifications. This is of course still a new channel, so any bit of feedback and criticism will greatly be appreciated. But with that being said, this has been Hard Rubber, and with that, goodbye.